Joining me now to discuss race relations in the U.S. is political commentator Ray Baker. Mr. Baker, welcome to the broadcast.
So happy to be here.
We've seen the footage, the video there many times play out over and over again. Many of the people there in this community feel like that this is an accurate portrayal of an atmosphere of racism in this community. We here cannot say what motivated this officer to shoot Mr. Scott and kill him. But this certainly is a huge black eye for race relations and law enforcement.
Absolutely, and I had the opportunity to go to Ferguson, Missouri in the immediate aftermath of the killing of Michael Brown. And what folks there were telling me was that their response to the killing of Michael Brown wasn't so much the isolated incident there, it was the pervasive behavior of white law enforcement all through St. Louis County. And there were so many folks coming from various parts of St. Louis County with their own stories of harassment, with their own stories of the police abusing them in various ways, and this was their chance to exercise this. And we believe the DOJ report brought that to light.
So nearly half of North Charleston's residents we're seeing are black. About 21% of the police force is African American. Would more minorities on the force actually help this problem, or is it just a continuing dialogue?
One would like to think that more minorities would help the problem. Unfortunately, as we saw as the video continued, there was an African American cop who walked over to the body of Mr. Scott, and one believed that that cop was standing behind the blue line, if you will. Also, we saw a man who was unarmed in Philadelphia was shot and killed by black law enforcement. And so what happens more often than not, we're finding African Americans, even when they get into law enforcement, taking on the same level of abuse, the same level of pervasive entitlement that other white Americans have behaved with regards to African American communities, thus ultimately ending in violence and abuse of those same communities.
So I'm wondering how economics play into this, because Mr. Scott was actually pulled over for a broken taillight. Then they find out that he's wanted for $18,000 in back child support. You heard his father just there in the piece before us saying that he didn't want to go back to jail. He ran. Is the racial divide along economic lines?
More often than not, it is. What we see is this awful confluence of race and class. What we find is that when we have African Americans of low income engaging with law enforcement, the policing, the way that those low income African American communities are policed are hyper aggressive in ways that unfortunately result in African American death. When we find low income white communities being policed, we don't see this happening with regards to death. Now, one thing that many people across the United States are asking for is an air of consistency. However law enforcement decides it wants to engage citizens, whether we're talking about behavior of running, whether we're talking about what is called threatening gestures, it should be applied evenly across the board. As we see, it's not. And unfortunately, African American, particularly men, but men and women, are being killed because of it.
So they're talking now, they're going to have the mandatory body cameras for the police officers, and that would help in many of these situations. Is the issue of poorly trained officers also factoring into this?
One can argue that there's poor training. However, it seems as though law enforcement's disposition is to approach African Americans as if they inherently are more threatening in their existence. So it begs the question, would various training change how one sees other human beings? And so the idea of body cameras that you alluded to earlier, we saw in Muskogee, Oklahoma, an unarmed African American man running from police who dropped his cell phone, reached back to pick up the cell phone, and was shot and killed by a police officer. The police officer there shot to kill, not shoot to wound, and we saw that that officer had his body camera on. Unfortunately, that doesn't bring that young man back to life.
All righty. Ray Baker, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.